I talk about executive resiliency, I don't talk about executives. I'm talking about the executive function, the ability to make decisions, the ability to act upon those decisions, and especially in large organizations when big issues occur. And just to frame it a little bit, I'll apologize now. I've been a firefighter, volunteer firefighter for 37 years. So a lot of my analogies will talk about firefighting, so I'll try and explain the best I can about that. But the whole idea is to get your teams a roadmap on how they can operate autonomously. And autonomously meaning not rogue, but basically autonomously in the fact that they have no communications or no ability to get authorization. So what do they need to do? Everyone's got the right frame here? Yes? All right, so where did this come from? You know, I'm a president of the New York chapter of Infragard, and part of Infragard's mission is to protect the national's critical infrastructure. So a lot of this has started when we were talking about how to, different methods of educating our members on how to protect national critical infrastructure. I had the chance to meet Lieutenant Colonel Bob Darling, who was in the bunker during 9/11. And he has written a really engaging book. And, you know, we met a few times over coffee and talked about, you know, his experiences in the bunker and the lessons he's learned and he gives in the book and some of the things we were trying to accomplish. So we said, what's the best way of trying to get people who aren't in a power of authority to take action? And we came up with this little phrase. Actually, it's Bob's phrase, so I can't take credit for it. Start doing more to live. And it consists of 5 different areas: sensing, decision making, determination, and learning. And probably some of this is going to be familiar to you in one sense or another. We're just trying to assemble it in a stepwise fashion, so that way you can determine whether what your organization's or what your team's role plays in the organization. So, the way I wanted to frame this, again, because it's a little bit about cyber and a little bit about physical infrastructure, we start to need to think differently. A lot of times, especially if you're from a big organization, you focus on what your team's output's going to be, right? What's your team metric? What is your role in the team, or what's your team's role in the line of business or in the bank? But we need to look bigger. We need to look bigger in scope, right? We need to look beyond an attack and a breach to an operational impact, right? And I'm not going to mention Equifax by name, but that's a good one. Because what happens is the operational impact leads to an organizational impact, right? I think there's only going to be 2 credit unions at the end of this year, but that's something they have to decide for themselves. But then you have to go beyond your organizational impact and say, is what we're experiencing a regional issue? Is someone actually looking to take down or affect the entire region or the entire sector? I belong to a group called the Financial Systemic Analysis and Resiliency Center. It's a coalition of 8 banks or 8 financial firms plus some that get together and they talk about basically what are the threats that they see that look systemic to the industry, not to their bank, but to the industry. So that's really important because that's the first time these groups have worked together in a non-adversary way to help each other. I know in our second year of the conference here, the theme was basically that security is altruistic. Right? In order to have good security, you need to share data. You need to cooperate more than and collaborate more than compete. So that's where that sector impact comes in. And outside of the sector impact, then you have to look even further. Is what we're experiencing have a national impact or a global impact? So it's really important to kind of take what you see and figure out and do some research, find out what the real scope of the issue is. It makes it real important when we get into the steps because knowing holistically what the issue is can help you take better steps to protect not only your team, your organization, but maybe the sector, maybe even the nation. We also have to go deep down. We have to kind of take more granularity in our preparedness. We need to looking at what our alliances are, right? We have our global alliances and our federal agencies that we deal with. Oh, let's see if we can do this again. Then we have to go down to, well, maybe we should start doing industry consortiums, right? So the FSARC is one of them. FSISAC, all the different ISACs are different ones. Special interest groups are always a great way of meeting people or meeting groups that have the same issues you have, but maybe from a different sector. So special interest groups, we have several in Infragard. We deal with electromagnetic pulses. That's one of the big ones that we have, and I'll talk about North Korea in a minute. But we also have to look at, all our organizations and lines of businesses and find out the details of how they're being affected as well, because we interact with those teams every day. Our businesses interact with those teams. So if we're down and they're down, well, maybe we all have to do something a different way. And it all comes down to me, individuals. I'll put my Infragard hat on again, and we'll talk about terrorism. To me, terrorism has three components. You have the physical aspect of it, right? You have the actual act itself. And then there's a technology aspect to it. Whether it's communication, whether it's planning, there's usually a technology or cyber aspect to things. And then there's also the human aspect, right? Somebody has to be the mastermind, somebody has to do the action, somebody has to do the thinking. So in that sense, there's a kill chain there. If you disrupt one of those, right, the physical action, like physical protection, or the human intel, or the cyber intel and the cybersecurity, you've disrupted a terrorist action or a potential terrorist action. And that's where it comes down to individuals. That's where that whole idea of you see something, say something came about, because you fix the small things and the big things will never happen. So let's talk about the 5 steps. The first step is sensing. In sensing, we want to find out, we want to train ourselves to understand what's our criteria, what's the threshold, when does a situation present itself? When does an event present itself? When does an event become an incident? When does an incident become a breach, right? We have to recognize that faster than the enemy, faster than the hackers. Some of the indications could be a loss of communications, whether it's app-to-app communications, whether it's physical communication with your superiors, whether it's lost transactions. We have to understand that when we start seeing these things, there might be a communication loss. So think bigger, right? It might be a loss that's bigger than what we know. And then we have to look at erratic performance, right? When things aren't working the way we plan. And I'll use a firefighter analogy. As a firefighter, you see a house burning. The first thing you do is you look at the house. Is it a high ranch? Is it a colonial? Because that tells you the layout of the house. Right? Colonial, and just for example, colonial has your living space on the bottom and your bedrooms on top, on the second floor. Well, if you go into the house and all of a sudden you make a left turn thinking you're going to go into the living room and you hit a wall, something's not right. Right? Something is abnormal there. And what happens is in the fire department, we call those SROs, or single room occupancies, which are illegal. So as a firefighter, you go into a smoky condition, you hit a wall where you don't expect one, you radio it in. You communicate with someone saying, this doesn't look right. And then they do, from the outside, they'll do an inspection. Same thing with our own systems. If we start seeing something erratic, don't just look at the system itself. Look around it. See what else is going on that might be affecting it. It might be a bug in the software. I mean, that's probably 99% of the time, because I really don't trust developers. But it could also be an insider threat. It could be a purposeful bug. The other thing you have to look at is proximal events. Events that are happening near you that don't affect you. Does everyone have know the Citizen app? It used to be called Vigilante. So there's an app for iPhone and Android called Citizen. And it's built for New York City and for San Francisco. And what it does, it's crowdsourcing threats or physical threats. So if something is happening near you, where your location is, it'll vibrate your phone, and you open it up and it'll tell you what's happening. There's a police report of a man running naked down Broadway. That happened the other day. And they'll actually have the response by the police department or the fire department. And then you have people who can submit videos, people in that area who can say, oh yeah, I see this happening. So that's a great idea of looking at proximal events. A little story, I happen to be working in DC every other week. I was in DC and my Citizen app went off and it said, car crash in Times Square. All right, you remember this event, right? So the car crash in Times Square was, something we didn't know if it was terrorism at the time. Again, we assumed the worst. We try and we work our way back. But I called the office in New York, and I asked the office in New York, which was literally at Bryant Park, right down the street, and I said, was the building notified that there was a possible terrorist issue going on? And they're like, no. Okay, so I called the building facilities. I said, is there any knowledge of this incident that just happened down in Times Square? And they said, yes, we heard about it, but we didn't tell anybody because the NYPD didn't want us to tell anybody. And I'm thinking, well, I did a quick calculation. Because it was lunchtime, we had approximately 7,500 employees possibly out at lunch during that time. So do you think that type of proximal event could have affected us? Absolutely. Absolutely. So it pays, again, be aware of what's around you. I also play ice hockey. In ice hockey, we call it putting your head on a swivel. You put your head on a swivel because you want to look around you all the time to see what's going on. And there's something called scaffolding issues. So scaffolding issues are like proximal events. They're indirect, but they end up leading to a bigger issue that you could have avoided. I like giving the example of the Romans. The Romans had aqueducts and irrigation and what they called marine setting cement. It allowed them to put blocks in salt water, and they would actually cure into cement, which allowed them to build arches, which allowed them to build aqueducts, which allowed them to bring water to the fields, which allowed them to grow crops, which allowed them to feed the armies. And if they knew if they had happy people, they would have strong armies, right? So a scaffolding event would be something where the irrigation system broke down or was destroyed. All you had to do is disrupt one of those items, and it becomes a scaffolding issue where now you can't feed your troops, and the troops are no longer happy because they need to keep their families well fed. And not that that led to the fall of the Romans, but again, it's one of those things that's a chained event. So if you think about your systems, how many of your systems rely on the internet, right? Well, how much does the internet rely on DNS? How much does DNS rely on BGP? And how many people know that, it was back in 2010 that 10% of all internet traffic was redirected to China, through China's routers because of a BGP breach, right? These are things that could have had a large effect on us. Luckily, it was caught in time. I think it was caught within a few hours, and the BGP's protocol was restored back to the way it was. But think about that. If we had all that internet traffic from the US going through the China's routers, right, possibly being captured and decrypted or whatever, what could have happened? Maybe it would have been bigger than Equifax. So sensing, keep your head on a swivel. After you sense that something's wrong, you have to decide, do we need to take action? Do we need to do something about it? Or are we just going to sit here? How many people work for large companies? Large being like politically large, right? When something happens, say your systems go down, you basically sit and wait until someone tells you, hey, we recognize the system went down and we're working on it. We'll get it back up, right? Maybe we need to take bigger precautions. Maybe we need to say, if our system goes down, we know we have an hour before customers start calling. Let's start looking into it ourselves. Let's start reaching out to our own development teams or our own system admins and see what's going on. At some point, maybe it's beyond our control, but maybe we need to do something. So that means we have to assume leadership. There's this whole theory about managing without authority, and that kind of falls into this assuming leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Bob Darling talks in his book about how during the 9/11 attacks, Cheney, the vice president, and Condoleezza Rice went down into the bunker with, and Darling was basically the communications guy, so he was on the phone the whole time, and that Cheney was barking out orders. But in our government, is the vice president allowed to make decisions? What's the chain of command in the government? President, right? I think it's Speaker of the House and Department of Defense, right? So Rumsfeld was nowhere to be found. Bush was in Florida and wasn't responding yet. In fact, actually, I think he was up in the air and he wasn't responding. So Cheney took command. If anything actually turned out worse than it did, someone could look at Cheney and say, you didn't have the authority to make that decision. But he knew that. He was willing to take that chance. He was willing to take that responsibility. So he assumed command because he knew the situation needed it. Same thing needs to happen, and I'm not saying everyone go rogue and start taking command of your own systems, but think about it. At what point are you going to wait and wait and wait and wait and nothing happens before you start taking action? And that's really, really important. When you assume leadership, there's two things you have to remember. You have to be prepared. You can't just assume leadership and say, hey, look at me, I'm ready to go. No. You have to prepare for this. You have to know what you want to do next. You have to know what you want to do 2 or 3 steps, because that's what people are going to ask you. People are going to ask you, well, what do we do now? But what if that doesn't work? What's going to happen next? You have to be prepared. You have to know if you had to build a system from scratch or the system went totally down, that you're going back to a paper-based system. Well, where are you going to get the paper? Where are you going to get the forms? Where are you going to get the people? So you have to kind of be prepared for that. The other important aspect of assuming control is your demeanor. And I always talk about soft skills. You could be the smartest person in the world, but if you can't communicate with people in the way that they want to be talked to, you're getting nowhere. And the opposite is true. You could say the nicest things, and you could be dumb as a rock, and people will follow you. So assuming leadership. So right as soon as you assume leadership, as soon as you make those 2 decisions, you decide that you're ready to take leadership, and you've communicated that to your team, and your team is ready, you got to start triage. What is triage? Triage is, what do I do immediately right now to lessen the risk? In the firefighting world, we joke that if someone sees a policeman, nobody's ever happy, right? If someone sees an ambulance pull up the scene, nobody's ever happy. They're very anxious. Whenever they see a fire truck pull up the scene, they go, whew, because things can only get better. And that's what you have to kind of get your team to believe, that once you start taking your first steps, whew, everything is going to get better from that point on. And that's what triage is all about. It's basically, looking at your situation, prioritizing it, taking control of it, giving a direction, and waiting and making sure that there's a response to that direction, right? Maybe your first direction is, I'm going to call corporate, or I'm going to call operations to see what's going on. And if that doesn't work, if I don't get a response from operations, this is what we're going to do next. But if we do get a response from operations, let's wait, let's see what they have to say. Let's give them a time frame of 15 minutes to get our systems back online before we take our next step. So that's about decision making. Any questions so far? I mean, I'm trying to be interactive, but I'm not. I'm sorry. So let's talk about making. Making is really taking action, right? Making is taking all your great ideas and finding out what's feasible, what's doable, and making it work. And how do you make it work effectively? We talked about the soft skills of good demeanor. Well, knowing your people is really, really important. Knowing who has the skills to do what. Knowing who doesn't have the skills, right? And give them something else to do, right? Maybe everybody, to me, and again, in the fire department, everybody has a job. You don't have to be the best firefighter. You don't have to be the best guy with a saw or an axe. You have a job. We have plenty of work for you to do. The same thing happens here. There's always plenty of work for people to do, but you have to know your people to assign them correctly and get them going. And if you say, hey, listen, Bill, I know you're great in cybersecurity operations. I said, can you go to the ops people and get this done, right? Or people love that. People want to hear that. People want to be useful, and that helps you in both ways. Then your second step is to kind of figure out what is an RPO. Everyone know business continuity term, RPO, recovery point operation. Basically, it's saying how much are you willing to lose to keep your minimum operations going. Right? That's the negative way of putting it. The positive way of putting it is how much can we retain and keep our business going. But in essence, you have to think of it in the negative terms. How much are we willing to lose and keep our business going to move on? And then we talk about continuity, taking in-band operations, things that were normally done outside. What can we do ourselves to help ourselves? If our systems aren't working and we're going to a paper-based system, well, it's great. We're filling out the forms when the people call and we're doing our things, but now where do the forms go next? We need a runner. We need someone to help us get that form to the next group and to keep the operations going. So that's the whole idea of continuity, is making sure that we have our automated systems have a backup and have a way of doing in-band operations. Our out-of-band operations are things that are outside of our control or things that we have to rely on other people for. It's inevitable. You do have to wait for someone to, if the internet is out, you do have to wait for someone to, help get the internet back up. You can't do that yourself. But in the meantime, you can deal with your in-band operations. And if all else fails, what do? Then you go to the steering committee. Then you start bringing groups of people together to get some ideas, doing some brainstorming. So, we're talking about, in this particular case, maybe we're talking about a short-term event, right? But the really important point that people don't tend to realize is, when do you stop doing something? At what point is everything back up to a point where you can go back to automation, go back to your systems, go back to servers, using your applications, get away from the paper system, or actually close out the paper system, right? Just because you have all this stuff on paper and your systems are back up doesn't mean it goes away. You have to kind of follow that paper trail all the way through so it's complete. So what's defined as normal? And this is part of your pre-planning. What is defined as normal? You have to basically figure out what's the criteria for an outage, and what's the criteria of normal? When do we say the outage is over? Again, in the fire department, there was a law in New York State that says only personnel with a CDL, commercial driver's license, can drive a fire truck. The only exception to that is if they're driving for an emergency. Right? Makes sense, right? Common sense, right? If it's an emergency and you're trained to drive a fire truck, you could drive a fire truck to the emergency. Problem came in the way the law was written, that simple. What happens after the fire's out? Is it an emergency? Who takes the fire truck back? And the cops, state police especially, were writing tickets to folks, to firefighters who were driving their trucks back from a fire scene. They did it to make a point, to basically say that the law was not written well. But again, what's considered your return to operations on that, and the proper way of doing things. Salvaging cleanup, we just talked about that. If you have a paper system that you're backing up on, you got to follow that paper system through. You got to make sure it's closed out. Everything, all the loose ends are tied. That's a big issue because people always want to go back to the easiest way of doing things, and they kind of forget what they've done. I call it organizational amnesia, where they all of a sudden, the light switch flips and they just forget everything that happened when it was dark. And then the most important thing is relinquishing leadership, right? It's easier, well, it's not easy, but it's nice to be able to say, hey, I'm stepping up to the plate. I'm ready to go. This is what we're going to do. At what point do you say, okay, let's go back to our old jobs? Not that people are power hungry, but you give a firefighter a hose and you tell them to open that hose, try and get them to close it, right? It's a power trip, right? But being able to relinquish control is really, really important, and it's a skill. It's not something that you can just do. It's something that you have to take the same demeanor you were when you were taking control, and give it back to people. Let people assume their old roles or old positions. And then of course, the final part is the post-mortem. I know everyone goes through a post-mortem on their incidents in a checklist format. I'm more of a touchy-feely type of guy, right? I'd rather have groupthink or group sessions and talk about what went wrong and document it later, rather than have people, hey, submit your list of everything you think was wrong, we'll talk about it. Now let's talk about it first, and let's figure out what's important, what's not important, what we could do better, and the result of that should be your checklist. I talk here about interim debriefing sessions depending on how long the incident is, and that could or does or does not mean that you can need to have them. And I'll give an example at the end of this about the electromagnetic pulse issue. Introspections, right? That's a whole, let's think about ourselves. Let's think about, I'll be the first one to admit that I'm not a great speaker. I'll be the first one to admit I'm ADHD, I tend to walk around a lot. So, use introspection. Use yourself as an example to help get the group thinking, get the group talking. Say something controversial, right? Spark some conversation. I mean, you could say something controversial that is totally wrong, but you want to get the group thinking in a different way. You don't want groupthink. You don't want everyone to be a yes person. Improve the decision-making process itself, right? So when you're talking about, what should we do in the future? How should we make these decisions in the future? there's a bunch of different theories on decision making, and the workshop yesterday talked about one of them. But when you need a decision to be made and how to make it. And again, this is all part of pre-planning for the next event. And of course, the last thing you need to do is act on it, right? It's great to have the talks, it's great to have the checklist, it's great to have the report, and the report goes up to management. But what are you doing to change it? It's not changing it for next time. What are you doing to change it today, to change the way you behave today that'll help you in the future? In a cyber incident, maybe it's, I don't rely on the internet going out. I want to check it all the time. I want to make sure that my connectivity between my servers, right, is taking the right route all the time. It's not being diverted. It's not being mishandled. So that's kind of the way we think of things. So I just want to kind of give a little example, or a big example. Electromagnetic pulses. I know there's a lot about North Korea these days, and they're testing their missiles, and they have some possibilities of nuclear warheads. One of the effects of this is not so much a direct hit from us. The missile only has to go above the atmosphere and explode above the atmosphere. It creates something called gamma rays, and the gamma rays come down and they actually fry your capacitors and fry your circuitry. And it becomes a big issue. Anything that's plugged in that has an electric current gets overloaded. Some things are safe. If it's shielded, it won't fry. But or if it's using the old tube, remember the vacuum tubes, it won't fry. But the capacitors, transistors, they will usually fry with an EMP. There was something in 1856 called the Carrington event. It was a solar flare, and it took out all the telegraph lines, right? Only temporarily, because telegraph lines are just wire, right? It's really the stations that went out. If there's something of the Carrington event happened today, it would take out our entire Northeast. So if you think about that blackout we had, how long was that blackout? 2 weeks? 72 hours? I felt like 2 weeks to me, I don't know. But if you think about something like the Carrington event, in today's day and age, it would take out the whole Northeast, and if it actually truly burns out the systems, we're talking about generators, right? The energy plant generators, which are, by the way, made in China, and there's an 18-month backlog. So if you think about that, can you do without electricity for 18 months? And what happens if the electricity goes out, right? Well, nuclear power plants can generate electricity, but what keeps the nuclear power plant going? Fukushima. What was the problem with Fukushima? Why did it overheat? Because the generators got flooded, and generators couldn't circulate clean water to the fuel rods that were being cooled. And again, one thing leads to another. So an energy plant needs energy to run. Kind of ironic, but it's true. So you think about something like the EMP event, and then you think about North Korea, how easy it is, or how it will be feasible for them to have an above atmospheric nuclear test or a nuclear event that could take out the Northeast. And I don't want to scare you. That's a big problem, right? We'd probably all just run away and hide for a while. But that's one of those big problems that the government is preparing for, the energy companies are preparing for. In fact, the energy companies found that if they are only 10% resilient, 10% resilient, so they have 10% of the generators on reserve or disconnected so they don't get burned out, they can handle 80% of the minimum viable operations to keep this country running. That's cool, right? Except that with the EMP event, it's not just the energy companies that will be burned out. All your computers, all your lights, all your circuit boards. So I think they'll generate electricity. They just won't have any place to deliver it to. So that becomes an issue in itself. Again, that's what they call a scaffolding event or a proximal event, right? So I mean, that's just one example. The other example is, and I used to do this when I worked at another company, is a lot of our companies deal with the internet as part of our delivery. I worked at a trading firm that used private lease lines, and they said, "Oh yeah, we can outlast an internet event because we're using private lease lines for all our connectivities between our turrets." So we asked the question, well, what if the internet goes out? Let's have a tabletop exercise. And everybody in the marketing and the frontline units said, we're going to be good. We're going to be good. Then you start talking to the developers and you say, great, your application, is that using any third-party sources? Is it pulling data from the internet on the back end? And they're like, yeah, why wouldn't it? I mean, of course, it saves us money, right? We don't, why would we want to cache that data? So now all of a sudden, we have this hole that says if the internet goes out, sure, you can run a turret, but it's not going to have any data in it. And that became a problem. Then there's the issue of, can the internet go out? I mean, how can it go out? Right? We have the transatlantic line, the trans-Pacific line, right? That's part of the big backbone. Who's watching all that? I know the Navy watches parts of it. The Coast Guard watches parts of it. But in the middle of the ocean, it's monitored. Actually, it's monitored by robots, underwater robots. But at any point in time, somebody could sabotage it. Right? It's not inconceivable. And we talked earlier about the Border Gateway Patrol, the BGP takeover. Right? That can happen again. I mean, BGP still hasn't. There is a BGP sec protocol, but really nobody's using it yet. So it's just like DNSSEC. It's just taking time. So all in all, I'm sorry I just kept rambling with some of the examples, but those are bigger examples. You can have smaller examples, and smaller meaning that they're contained to your responsibility, but that responsibility could blow up into something bigger. And Equifax is a good example of that. So any questions on those 5 steps? Doing more, right? Doing more to live. I have a sensing, start doing more to live. I have these in the back on that counter over there. It's just basically a little checklist of things that you should be doing with your teams if you want to take this back. And I'll take any questions. Sir.
Do you work closely with DHS, DOE, etc., where they really deal with critical infrastructure, or chemical plants, fertilizer, or oil and gas, energy, where any such incident?
In which role? So in my full-time role, yes, and in my Infragard role, yes. So the Infragard role is basically an FBI outreach program. So we have an FBI coordinator we work with. That's our direct line, but we will actually work with other parts. We have meetings where we have DHS folks come in and talk about that stuff.
So the methodology that you described holds for any of those critical infrastructures?
Yes, we have
incident response.
We'll have there's 6. The federal government defines 16 critical infrastructures. In New York City, we handle maybe 4 or 5 immediately, and then we'll have we do finance, energy, commercial facilities, government facilities. So we handle 4 or 5, and then the other ones, if we have enough speakers, we'll bring them in for expertise. Cool.
Thank you.
Thanks. Hi, John. In your full-time job, how many times a year is your system tested? And do you have any anecdotes about places where there's something you wish you'd done or had in place?
Testing is such an ambiguous term.
Or used.
Yeah, I mean, well, let me talk a little bit. If you ask your CEO how many times your company's been breached, they'll say 0, 1 time a year, right, or attacked. If you ask your SOC analyst how many times your company's been attacked, he'll say 1,000 times a second, right? It depends on all perspective. So when you're talking about testing, it's the same issue. What does testing mean, right? Are you talking about application testing, system testing, end-to-end testing? So there's for software lifecycle development, there's testing. For systems, there is verification and testing, right? So that we have the agents that go around and test those systems to make sure all the critical components of that application are working. So it depends on the software you're using or the agents you're using on the systems. But then you have the routing systems, right? The infrastructure. How often is that infrastructure tested? I can't answer that question. Cool. Well, thank you.